With the second season of Alice in Borderland, we saw multiple games unfolding for the group that was stuck inside of Borderland, with them completing the numbered card games in the first season of the show. This then meant that they were now embarking on the tasks of completing the face card games in order to find out the truth behind why they were stuck there, and how they'd be able to return to the real world. With us seeing multiple high-stake, dangerous games, I thought I'd break down and explain all of the games that we saw unfolding. So let's get into it. Here is Alice in Borderland Season 2, Every Game Explained. Just to let you know, this video will contain spoilers. The King of Spades. The first game that we saw unfold in this season of the show was essentially a free-for-all where all of the members in Borderland had to escape the impending doom that was destined to occur if they crossed paths with the King of Spades. Unlike the other games where they'd have to go to the blimp in order for it to be activated, this was occurring throughout the entirety of Borderland, so there was no stopping or winning unless the people themselves took out the King of Spades and stopped him coming after them. He was a mercenary, so he was a highly skilled individual and well equipped in wiping out a high number of people that were in his path, especially considering that the players didn't have anything to protect themselves either, so it was most certainly one of the more difficult games to complete. This was due to the fact that the odds were quite literally stacked against the competitors. However, we did see that his demise wasn't necessarily caused by him being outsmarted by the group, as he wasn't originally going to open the door that was booby-trapped, but he was forced to do so, which in turn meant that the game was complete. I'd say that this was most probably one of the most difficult games of the season, as there was quite literally no escape. Osmosis. Osmosis was the first team-based game. We saw the group head towards a yard that was full of storage container units, where they met with the King of Clubs. Each team started with 10,000 points, and the points were essentially split amongst the members of the teams. It was then down to the members of the team to go after the opposition players and risk touching them. If they had more points than the person that they touched, then they'd take 500 points from the loser, which would then be deducted from the whole team. If an individual felt as though they didn't have as many points as the person that was standing in front of them, they could hold on to a member of their team who they believed could have a good amount of points, which would then mean that their points were combined, and if it was larger than their direct opponent, then they would ultimately take the 500 points. There were also hidden items around the yard that people could retrieve. Inside of the containers there were buttons that needed to be pressed, and if they were found, they'd contain point bundles that would go towards the overall tally of the points for the group. These ranged from 500 extra points to 3,000 extra points. If a player was touching their own base, then it meant that they had infinite points, so if they touched an opposition player there, then there'd be no way of beating them. The person who was not touching the base would lose 10,000 points, and if they didn't have that inside of their wristband, then it was game over for them. If a player's point fell below 0 and into a negative number, it would then mean that they would lose the game on an individual level and would then be taken out. By the end of the allocated time limit, the team that had the most points would win the game, and the losers ended up being hit by a laser beam, ultimately wiping them out. This was a tense game that provided twists and turns throughout all of it. The fact that it spanned across 3 episodes also made it a good one. Solitary Confinement. Solitary Confinement was all about trust and being able to find the liar that was amongst the group. It was a little bit like Among Us in the sense that there was an imposter who held the title of the Jack of Hearts within the group, and they were trying to stay alive. If they were caught, then they would die. But if they managed to survive until the end of the game, then they'd be able to walk free. The group had collars around their necks with a symbol on the back of it from a deck of cards. They were unable to see it themselves, but they had to trust the people that were around them to tell them what their symbol was. If they were told the right one and they announced it in their cell, then they'd walk free and into the next round. But if they were told the wrong one and announced it, then they'd be killed on the spot. It was a game of trusting each other, but working out who was the person that was slyly trying to stay alive and sabotage the game. It was in the group's best interest to work together, but it did seem as though at a time where they needed to work as one, many of them decided to only look out for themselves. Checkmate. Checkmate was an interesting game. It was essentially like one big game of tag. Battling over several rounds, we saw the Reds face the Blues, and the winner would then be decided by which team held the most amount of members at the end. We saw the Queen of Spades held the least amount of members to start with, but by utilizing her knowledge of the game, the map, and knowing how best to approach the game, we saw her starting to win. However, as time went on, we saw that Terisu and Usagi managed to capture all of the people that were once in their team and bring their numbers right to the top, ultimately winning the game. This game was about agility, speed, stamina, and movement, but it was also inside of the mind a lot of the time. As being captured by the Queen and being on the Queen's winning team, it meant that you could live every day playing this game, where it essentially meant that you were relatively safe compared to some others. And it was something that seemed appealing to many of the players stuck inside of Borderland. The rules were quite straightforward and was definitely one of the more simpler games to get your head around. Beauty contest. And having a screen with numbers from 0 to 100, we saw several opponents all sat underneath a pot of sulfuric acid that would fill up every time somebody didn't win a round. Players would have to pick a number between 0 to 100, and the person who then got the closest to the average that was then multiplied by 0.8 meant that they were the winner of the round and had no points deducted from them. However, all of the other players would have points taken away from their score. The players that would reach -10 would have the pot of sulfuric acid poured over them and would then be eliminated from the game and, well, life. The final player that was left, which would have been the person who was able to predict their opponent's moves, was able to be unshackled from the chair underneath the pot and was then able to walk free. Croquet. The final game that we saw in the show was in the finale of the season. This was managed by the Queen of Hearts, who was formerly known as Mira. The game was simple. It was based on croquet, and all they had to do was complete the 3 rounds that were ahead of them. There was no need to win. The only rule was don't forfeit, don't quit, and finish the game. We saw 2 rounds get completed, but it was here where we found out that it wasn't going to be the easiest game to not quit. This was because we saw Mira get inside of Arisu's head and try to get him to quit the game by tricking him into believing different reasons as to why he was stuck in Borderland. She was ultimately impacting his mental state and trying to get him to take something which would have meant that he would have quit and died in real life. The skills required to beat this game were mental strength, support, and awareness of what was real and what was fake. The result of not taking what Mira was offering and surviving meant that the player would then go back to complete the final round of croquet, and then she would be destroyed, thus meaning all of the phase cards would then be completed, and the decision of whether to take up residency or not would be put to the player. Other games. Within the show, we saw a couple of other games that didn't get the full focus when compared to the main ones. We saw a version of Enhanced Dodgeball where the opponents looked as though they would be knocked off of a steep drop if they were hit by the ball. We saw a similar game to that, which was based around climbing a rope up high in some kind of race, and if it wasn't completed, then the laser would come and wipe them out. There was also another one that we saw Akana participate in. This was centered inside of an arena, and after the stadium exploded, boiling water then started to rise. Players would need to try and escape the walls of the stadium, and if they managed to, then they'd win. And there was also a game that looked as though it was like hide and seek down a narrow corridor, where it looked as though you needed to avoid being found. There were many games within this season of the show, games that required a lot of thought, physical skills, and mental strength in order to complete. With consequences and stakes that were higher than ever, the games were extremely entertaining to watch. And for that, you have to commend the writing team. Whilst I know there may not be another season, I really hope there is, so we can see more of this thrilling, exciting gameplay, as there's nothing else like it. So, there you have it. Alice in Borderland Season 2, Every Game Explained.